In this lesson, we'll take a look at how to create a marker drawing, and in this case, we'll take a look at drawing a skull. We'll start on marker paper, which is nice and smooth and able to accept marker applications without much bleeding. We'll start by creating a loose contour line sketch of our subject using a light graphite pencil. Now, marker paper is super smooth, so your graphite marks will just slide over the surface easily. I'm using an H pencil here because I don't want the graphite marks to be visible in the final image. We can now finalize the contour lines and make any alterations as necessary. And before applying marker applications, we can gently lift some of the graphite using a kneaded eraser. We'll leave a light contour line drawing of the skull on the surface. Now we're ready to start making marker applications, and for this demonstration I'm using Prismacolor Premier markers. These markers are considered to be professional markers. They are alcohol-based and they feature a dye-based ink. Now we're going to start here with 20% warm gray. Of course, there's warm grays and cool grays. All of the grays that we're going to create in this image are going to be warm gray. So we're going to start with 20% warm gray. And what we're going to do is we're going to create somewhat of an underpainting. So we're going to develop a monochromatic image made up only of values. And then we're going to apply the colors over the top. So we're going to start with the lighter values here, and progressively we're going to get darker with our applications. Just like with working with ink, once you make a mark on the surface with the marker, of course, it's there. There's no way to go back and lift it up or erase it out. So we're going to be very careful with our applications. Prismacolor Premier markers have a broad tip and they also have a fine tip on the other side. In the beginning stages here, I'm going to use mostly the broad tip. And I'm thinking about the marks that I'm pulling with this broad tip as almost being brush strokes. Now, as you can see here, I can go back in and make some of the values a little bit darker with an additional application. Each time we go over an area that we've already applied the ink in the marker, it's going to get a little bit darker. This allows us to slowly and progressively build up the values. Of course, value is going to be very important in creating the illusion of the form of the skull, just like it is in any drawing or painting that we create. In this case, the light source is originating from the upper right-hand corner, meaning that most of the darker values are going to exist on the left side of the skull and the left side of each one of the protruding features. Of course, darker values will also exist in the areas that recede, like the orbital sockets, inside of the nasal cavity, and just underneath and inside of the skull. As we keep making these marks, we start to see a value range develop, and we start to get a better understanding of the form of the skull. It's important to recognize that you don't have to make all of the values with one sweeping motion. In other words, we're still using the same marker that we started with, the 20% warm gray. We're just able to develop quite a number of values with this one marker. All right, now we're going to switch over to 50% warm gray, and as you can see here, it's quite a bit darker. And then we're going to go back over the areas that we've already put down some of the 20% warm gray and start to push those values a little bit darker. And of course, these darker values are going to exist where I mentioned before, predominantly on the left side of the skull and in the areas that are recessed. Now, as you can see, there's quite a bit of contrast between the 50% warm gray and the 20% warm gray, even in areas where we've applied multiple applications of the 20% warm gray. To make these marks, it might be helpful to think about the locations of darker value in your subject as simplified shapes. Then we can just draw the simplified shapes with the darker value that we're observing from the subject. We can always go back and ease transitions a little bit further with additional applications of the 20% warm gray. As we continue to develop the contrast in value, of course, we're pushing the value range further, meaning that we have a broader range of values in the subject. This, of course, furthers the illusion of the form of the skull, which, of course, is very important. Now at this point, I can switch over to the fine tip and start to address some of the detailed areas with this darker value. Now, I mentioned before that we're creating an underpainting essentially here. And what this does is it allows us to concentrate on the values in one part of the process and the colors in a completely separate part of the process. If we were to dive right in by addressing the colors, of course, we'd have to find a marker that not only matched the color that we wanted to portray in the image, but also the value that we wanted to convey in the image as well. Once we have our underpainting, so to speak, in place, we can go over the top of it with applications of color. Now, since the color is semi-transparent, the values underneath will affect the colors that we apply on top, essentially making darker values or darker versions of the colors that we apply. We'll continue to develop the details with the fine tip here, still working with the 50% warm gray. And of course, as we do so, we're concentrating on the directional strokes that we make as well. As I mentioned before, we want to think about the marks that we make with the marker as almost being brush strokes. And of course, the direction of the brush strokes can imply the form of the subject even further. In this case, the contrast between the 50% warm gray and the 20% warm gray is a little bit strong in areas. So I'll revisit with the 20% warm gray and add a few additional applications to ease those transitions of value. And then I can go back and work more of the details of the shadows that happen around the teeth, again with the 50% warm gray. Now, I'll remind you at this point, we've only been working with two markers, the 20% warm gray and the 50% warm gray. So you can really see here that you can produce a pretty broad range of value and model the illusion of form with just a couple of markers. We'll strengthen the shadow at the bottom of the jawbone and add a couple of marks for some sinus cavities. And then there's quite a number of shadows that happen underneath the bottom teeth as well, so we'll address those with the 50% warm gray. And we're leaving areas of highlight. Of course, we're going to allow the white of the paper to do a lot of the work here when we're addressing the highlights. And then here again, we'll ease some transitions of value with the 20% warm gray, going back to the lighter marker, before darkening the shadow on the left side of the jawbone with the 50% warm gray. And here again, we can see additional applications make the value slightly darker. We'll make a few adjustments in the nasal cavity and around the orbital sockets, darkening them up just a slight bit. And now to make the top portion of the skull feel a bit more rounded, we'll pull that darker shadow around and add a bit of a curve to it. Now going back with the 20% warm gray, we'll ease that transition a little bit and create a few more marks on the upper portion of the skull. And then again with the 50% warm gray, we'll add a few more marks that extend over the top of that edge just so that curve is not so strong. Now we're ready to switch over to our darker gray, and in this case we're using 70% warm gray. And just like we did with the 50% warm gray, we're going to go over the areas of darkest value. The addition of this darker marker, of course, is going to broaden the range of value in the image, which in turn will help to further the illusion of the form of the skull and also the illusion of the light source in the image. Now, since this marker is so much darker, I'm going to use the fine tip for most of the applications. The contrast between it and the 50% warm gray is not as strong as the contrast between the 50% warm gray and the 20% warm gray. For this reason, we don't have to worry too much about transition areas. We'll continue to darken areas as we see fit, in this case inside of the orbital sockets. And we'll also darken up some of the values inside of the nasal cavity as well. And at this point, we're really starting to see that contrast work. Of course, some of the darkest values happen around the teeth, so we'll address these areas as well. And to finish up the underpainting, we'll darken up some of the areas on the back side of the skull. Now we're ready to start addressing the color. And in this example, I want to create a color relationship between orange and blue. Orange and blue, of course, are complementary colors. I'll be using blue in the areas of shadow, and I'll be using orange hues in the areas of highlight. So we'll start here by applying the color light cerulean blue over the areas of shadow. Now we'll allow these blue marks to extend outside of the boundaries of the shadows as well. We want these little pops of color to interact with the warmer colors that we'll add in a moment. Since most of the values are in place thanks to our underpainting, we can use the broad tip for these marks. They can be loose, and we can have a bit of fun with these applications. Now that we've got our blue in place, we'll switch over to some of our warmer hues, and we'll start with the color cream. I'm applying the cream, of course, in the areas of lighter value. We'll allow these warmer tones to overlap the blues in areas, adding a bit more complexity to the color. Here again, we can use the broad tip for these applications, since we don't have to worry about any of the details. Now we can start adding our orange hues and create some strong contrast between the color. For this, I'll make applications with the color light peach. These orange applications are made mainly in the areas of transition, in between the blues and the cream. Here again, we'll allow some of the marks to overlap, again creating more complexity in the color. Now we'll add a third color, mainly in the areas of transition between the orange and the cream. This time we'll apply Deco Pink. Using the fine tip, we'll make a few applications with the light cerulean blue on the side of shadow within each tooth. Now we'll add an area of cast shadow underneath and behind the skull, furthering the illusion of light. We'll use black for this. First, we'll fill in the area between the jaw and the upper portion of the skull. Then, using the fine tip, we'll define the edge of the cast shadow around the edge of the skull. Then, using the broad tip, we can go ahead and fill in a nice solid application in the area of cast shadow. And now our drawing of a skull created with Prismacolor Premier markers is now complete. If you enjoyed this video, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel, and if you're ready to learn more about drawing and painting, then why not check out our comprehensive membership program, which includes video courses, weekly live lessons, ebooks, lesson plans, and much, much more. Just click on the button on the center of your screen to learn more about our program, or click on the card in the upper right-hand corner. Thank you so much for watching.